Super duper important question. Probably the most important question I've ever asked you, Hunter.
Really?
What's the phase of the moon right now?
Oh, wow. I didn't see that one coming exactly. The phase of I remember there was a full moon a few weeks ago, so it's not full.
It is not full.
I feel like it's waxing or waning, something maybe. I don't know.
It is usually either waxing or waning, as it turns
Right. So
out.
so I guess I was playing it pretty broadly there.
I think we could probably ask 99% of people, and most people wouldn't know. However, I would argue that this is how most people interact with the moon most, right?
Okay.
It's like they look up and see sort of what it's doing. Is it up there? Sort of, is it a thumbnail kind of thing?
Right.
As it turns out, on today, July 12th is when we're recording this. It is a waxing crescent moon, which means it is 37% illuminated, and we are spiraling towards a full moon right now. So that's where we're at.
To a full moon?
Yeah, we're getting more moon as the days go by. So tomorrow, July 13th, will be a first quarter moon, so it'll be 46% illuminated.
Okay.
I believe. Let's see if I have my little website here. The next full moon will be July 21st, where it'll be 100%.
So it's coming up. Yeah.
So let's see. As you're listening to this, listener, on the 16th of July, you will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days away from a full moon. So there you go. That's your full moon check. If you want to know, if you're doing some looking at some stars that night, on the 21st might not be the best night, as it turns out. The moon is quite bright and will ruin that experience for you. So, all right. As you can probably guess, we are going to talk all about the moon today. Really quick though, before we get into it, last week, this episode was supposed to come out last week. It didn't, obviously. You all got a remix episode. Sorry for that. Schedules kind of get away from us sometimes, and this one's one of the ones that slipped. But we're happy to be able to bring back and talk about the moon today, because it should be a really fun episode. Yeah, we're back. Yeah, we also have, this is also one of our episodes where we have a special guest episode that's coming out in a couple of days. So we have Trevor Churleen, from more commonly known as Plateau Astro, on social media to help talk a lot more about the science-y parts of what we're going to be talking about today. So everything you listen to today, at least most of the things you listen to today when we talk about the science, if you want more information, come back and listen to Trevor talk about it.
Highly recommend. Great guest. Definitely come back. Check it out on Thursday or any other day after that.
Yeah. And we we say this, but having guests is fun.
It is fun.
It's definitely something we want to do more of.
Yeah.
We don't have the expertise, so we just talk about geography. So let's get back to the moon. So, listener, if you did recall, we have done an episode that's kind of moon adjacent. We did a 2-part episode on the space race. We covered the classic space race. We covered the modern space race in 2 episodes. We're going to talk a little bit about the space race in this episode, because we can't really avoid it when we're talking about the moon. But those 2 episodes will obviously have a lot more information for you. But in both of those episodes, the moon did feature very prominently. However, it was more of a geopolitical conversation. And so today we're going to talk more about the culture of the moon, sort of what the moon is doing. What is it meant for people? And really how did we get a moon in the first place? Because not every planet has a moon. I think a lot do, but not everybody.
Some have lots of moons, though.
Some have lots of moons, right? Jupiter has I want to say 30 moons or something like that. It's incredible.
That's a lot to keep track.
We do not have 30 moons. Yeah. We just have the one. Only the lonely for us. I also want to call out, before we get into the actual episode, that I relied heavily on Ben Moore's book, Moon, Past, Present, and Future, to guide much of my research. It was really nice to be able to have a single book that kind of talked about everything that I kind of wanted to cover today. Obviously, if you want more information, if you're really fascinated by the moon at the end of today's episode, go check out that book. I found it to be a really easy read, and he was explaining things in a way that was understandable for somebody who's not an astronomer or an astrophysicist. And I'm definitely not either of those things. So go check it out. Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into it. And we're going to start with why we have a moon in the first place. So, Hunter, we've said this before. This might be the time when we go back the very farthest we've ever gone. In fact, I don't know how much farther we can go back at this point, unless we do a geography as the sun, in which case that is probably an episode that will happen at some point.
Yeah, we might have to do that, but you're right. We keep pushing it back further, but I can understand for this particular topic, we have to go back further than ever.
Further than ever. So, Hunter, where do you think the moon came from?
It came from a galaxy far, far away. I'm not sure, a long time ago, just floated by and wanted to hang out. This is a question that's never been posed to me before. I'm not sure I've ever thought too much about this, but now that you pose it, I'm realizing I don't really have a good idea about where the moon came from.
People have ideas, but I think as we're going to find out, it's a mystery still to this day. Obviously, how could it not be? Nobody was around back then. So we're going to talk about some of the origin theories behind the moon. In particular, one. We're going to talk about one because it seems to be the most prominent. But it's just there's just no way for us to ever know.
Right. And where there are theories, there's debate, right? So
right, exactly. And we're gonna cover that too.
Exception. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so obviously the moon's origins mystery, but due to recent science that largely spawned out of the Apollo program's moon landings, we have sort of some better ideas, and we're going to talk a little about that. So one very important fact that we learned from Apollo's program, the findings there, is that the rocks on the moon and the Earth are virtually identical. They're very similar. So obviously there's going to be some differences, but they're not, the moon, for example, the moon isn't made of cheese, which I think was a common children's myth.
I heard that a lot growing up, and I was always kind of suspect of that explanation, but having never been there, I wasn't sure.
Mm-hmm. And after finding this out, that the rocks were basically similar, very similar, this would lead to a theory called the impact model. Have you heard of this theory, Hunter?
I'm not familiar with the impact model, no.
So let's talk about it. So in 1974, just after the Apollo program ended, Cornell University hosted a conference on planetary satellites. There, the astronomers William Hartman and Donald Davis presented a new model of the moon's origins. So this was a new idea. I think people have been thinking about this for a long time. The ancient Greeks have been thinking about this for like millennia now, right?
How could you not? I mean, how could you look up in the sky and see this thing at night and it changes and you're wondering, well, where did that come from?
Right. I mean, yeah, we're going to talk a little about the ancient history as well. But for all of what you just said, right? It's this omnipresent entity that's in the sky. There's going to be people wondering about it. So in 1974, these two astronomers sort of presented a new theory. And according to Hartman and Davis, a planet, and this is the impact model theory, a planet the size of Mars, or roughly equivalent to, which is a little bit smaller than Earth for people who aren't aware, collided with Earth around 4.5 billion years ago. And so this is what I'm saying. We're definitely farther back than we've ever been before.
And we've not gone back 4.5 billion years before, no.
I don't believe so. So, but it was this great collision, as it happened, that vaporized a massive fraction of Earth's surface. Again, obviously, how could it not? Mars is still really big. If it crashes into another planet, it's gonna leave a mark. And when it happened, the smaller planet that hit it sent debris flying into orbit around Earth. Right. Okay. And so this smaller planet hit it. There's debris everywhere, sent it flying around into orbit. That debris then formed a spinning disk of matter that eventually coalesced into the moon. So at one point, if you look up to Saturn, or if you see a picture of Saturn, you can see that it has a disk, right? That sort of, debris that sort of floats around it.
Right.
At one point.
Yeah.
Right. It's very famous. It's very cool. I would argue Saturn is probably the coolest moon the coolest planet because of that. It's got a little bit of an edge to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, when it's like a planet's like combing its hair back, it's like the cool one.
If only.
But so at one point, Earth also would likely had some sort of ring as well. And then just over sort of millions of years, billions of years, perhaps, the debris coalesced and sort of compacted itself and formed into the moon that we now have today. And so that's sort of the impact theory. In the years since Hartman and Davis announced this new theory of theirs, numerous scientists have contested it. So we'll talk a little bit about sort of what's going on there. These scientists argue that if a planet collided with Earth and material resulting from that collision combined to form the moon, then the moon should clearly be a mixture of both. So if you go back to what we already
Right.
said,
Right.
right, the rocks that they sort of found on the moon were virtually identical to rocks found on Earth. Therefore, if there was an actual planet that was not of Earth that collided into Earth, there would be more of a mixture, right? Solid reasoning, I would
I
suggest,
suppose.
right?
Yeah. I mean, but unless the planet that crashed into Earth was Earth-like, I
Yeah,
don't know. Or maybe
I
we
don't.
haven't been to that part of the moon, dark side of the moon. That's where the other rocks are hanging out. I don't know.
I know. These are the questions I had too. The book doesn't dive too much more into
Hmm.
sort of the other, I guess the debate that goes back and forth. So then there's the theory, and then there's the debate they don't go back into like well then here's another thing for why the
Right.
impact theory. It doesn't really do that too much. But I had some of the same questions. It's like, okay, well, they brought back some rocks from the moon landings, but did
Like
they bring back the right rocks, right?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, they didn't like get a tractor up there and shovel like 3 tons of this stuff.
No,
It was
there's
a
no
relatively
backhoe, nothing like that. Yeah.
so I again, it could be true, but it could also, I don't know, again, the dark side of the moon, maybe that's where all of the extraplanetary moon rocks are.
Could be.
Um, but so again, to the people who are debating against this theory, apparently to them, the moon is too similar to Earth for the impact model to be true.
Okay.
No matter where in the solar system the planet that hit Earth had formed, its chemical properties would have been different from Earth's. So
Hmm.
I guess that's what they were arguing. And we know this because we've tested meteorites that formed from rocks on Mars, and they are considerably different, apparently, from Earth rocks. So again, I don't know. Again, maybe there's just some hidden rock somewhere. Maybe it's deeper into the crust. I don't know. Or maybe the impact model's wrong, which it very well likely could be because it's just a theory. It's that's how theories work.
It's
Most
a
of
great
them are
thing
wrong.
about making a theory about something that happened 4 billion years ago is you might never be disproved.
Right. Yeah. So according to them, the impact model doesn't quite work. However, current science has come up with maybe a potential solution to bridge the two a little bit, a merger, if you will, between these two sort of ideas. So there could have been two planets, apparently similarly sized planets, that rather than a giant impact that sort of combined and coalesced into sort of the moon. That's sort of what it's going for. And after they spiraled around each other, the enormous gravitational force of the two planets would have pulled them together, forming Earth. And so that's sort of an idea of how Earth formed. And the material from both planets would have completely mixed and become identical. The moon then would have been the result of a fragment splitting off from the still forming planet. And so that's sort of the other theory. It's like, okay, maybe it wasn't an impact, but maybe there's still some ideas here. There was two planets. They sort of eventually pulled each other together, formed to become Earth, and a smaller fragment that just didn't quite make it. Maybe it was sort of a hanger on, would eventually depart and become sort of the moon. That's maybe how you can get there. I don't know.
This is fascinating. I've never considered that possibility that Earth is really two previous planets.
I don't know. I mean, nobody really knows.
Or multiple planets. Yeah.
Again, the truth is, none of us are ever really going to know this. That's just the nature of history. Something we've constantly said on this podcast, but obviously for this one, it's just going to be impossible. Absolutely. So let's leave behind sort of the origins of the moon. Let's move to sort of how the moon has impacted human civilizations and what it's done for people. Because that's, we're human geographers, we're cultural geographers. That's a big part of what we care about.
Absolutely.
And obviously the moon, we talked about this already a little bit. The moon has obviously had a huge impact on humans, because how could it not? It's
right. Across civilizations, the moon figures prominently, it would seem.
Yeah. Yeah. Hunter, how do you think, if you're looking back to ancient history, how do you think people would have, interpreted the moon?
Well, I think the moon and the sun are these very prominent features. And I think a lot of cosmology, a lot of beliefs about origin stories or the way that the world works, they become personified in stories about gods and goddesses.
Oh yeah.
And so I think there's probably a lot of that. I mean, just, thinking back to Romans and the Greeks and the Egyptians and others, there's a sun god, there's a moon god, and they were pretty powerful. And it's probably supposed to a story or some kind of meaning to the people. So the religious people, they have this interpretation, and then the moon is used to tell them about themselves in some way.
Absolutely. Right. You basically did, you gave us a high level of what we're going to dive a little bit deeper into. But yes, I mean, ancient peoples looked up at these things, the sun and the moon, and they were like, these are gods. And which makes sense, right? It's
a reasonable thought.
These are
like
at that moment in time when there is sort of a pre-science kind of world, obviously pre-scientific theory. There's you could only ever interpret these things as omnipotent beings because
when I was a kid, I remember laying in the back of my parents' station wagon, which would be illegal and have them thrown in prison today, probably. But back then, people weren't worried about that as much for some reason. I remember just staring at the moon, and I felt like it was following us. And so I remember asking my parents, why is the moon following us? And they're like, well, it's not following us. It's just really big and kind of always there. But I was, my own self mythology. I was like, what is this thing? Why is it always following me? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it looks like it's constantly looking down on you, right? It's like this thing. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about this. So from the Eurasian steppes to African plains, the moon has been a constant presence and has influenced various religions and ideas around sort of gods and goddesses. It was really an omnipotent celestial object for humans all around the world, right? And the longer that these people gazed at the moon, the more these ancient peoples did seek an explanation for it. And so, lacking sort of the math and science that we have today, they assumed that these would be, gods and so there would be stories attached to them, right? So I have an example here from the Mahabharata, which is a 4th century BCE Indian epic, and it explains lunar eclipses with a story, right? So there's a story up there. I'm going to run through sort of high level what the story is.
Okay.
This is not go read the Mahabharata if you actually want the full story.
Right, if you want the version.
Yeah. So gods and demons, it says, once agreed to work together to produce an elixir of immortality. However, the gods betrayed the demons and stole their elixir. During the ensuing quarrel, the demon Rahu snuck into the gods' camp and tried to steal it back. But the sun and moon warned the god Vishnu, who woke and beheaded Rahu. Little dark, grim. Most of these ancient stories are. That's okay.
We have a lot of these kinds of stories. Yeah.
Yes. Rahu's headless body and bodiless head were then fated for eternity to chase the sun and moon angrily through the night sky. An eclipse happens when Rahu's head catches one of his betrayers and swallows it, causing a darkening of the sky. However, because he's only a severed head, the moon or sun slips back out through his disconnected neck. It's kind of I mean, it's kind of a fantastical story, obviously, but it's like the idea here is that it's trying to take not only these two celestial objects that are already immense and very powerful to these people who are trying to explain it, but it's also trying to take a certain event that happens with them and Earth itself and explain it, right? And it's trying to give sort of logical processes for why an eclipse happens and then why it ends as well, which I thought was really fascinating.
It's a way of tying what's in space to the Earth, right? It's a way of trying to connect these things. So it makes sense that people would speculate on this and come up with stories. Yeah,
exactly. Well, Hunter, if you can believe it, the first attempts to actually move away from sort of supernatural explanations of the moon and sort of start trying to explain what actually is happening up there would actually come much farther back. It would come basically in the 6th century of BCE with ancient Greece, a time when this would be like a time when there was a lot of sort of human ingenuity happening, a lot of philosophers, right? The ancient Greek was well known for this, but I think this idea that this was happening so early would probably still surprise a lot of people, that there was ancient Greeks looking up at the moon and thinking, well, that's not a god, that's something else, and we want to figure out what that is. And I think that's kind of wild. Most importantly,
their time, I guess, and they'll come up with some interesting ideas. Yeah,
right, exactly. Yeah. So the Greeks were
had to do the philosophers. They didn't have a 9 to 5 or anything like that. Their job was just to think about stuff, mostly.
Just to think about stuff. Yeah. So the Greeks, apparently, as far as we know, were the first to break from the idea that gods controlled the cosmos and the events of the earth. There could have been other peoples around the planet. We just don't have that information on hand. And instead, the Greeks perceived a world of material objects acting under strict laws. And this would ultimately come to be formed what we know today as physics, right? So there's a few important thinkers that stand out during this process. There's Pythagoras, who lived around 570 to 495 BCE, and determined that the Earth was spherical by observing the way that light reflects on the moon, which was a vital step in understanding basically space and sort of everything that would come after it. Listeners, you might also recognize that name, Pythagoras. He is also the person who invented came up with the Pythagorean theorem, something like that. It's a math thing. Basically, it's like instead of going up and left, you could just do the cross over or something like that. I'm not a math person, but I remember that from my math days.
We should all be so lucky to have one of our ideas endure for 2,500 years. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In 5th century BCE, Parmenides discovered that the moon reflects light from the sun, which again, that's another very important aspect of understanding the moon and sort of how things are working within our planet. Later on, in the 3rd century BCE, Aristarchus correctly identified our place in the solar system and attempted to gauge the moon's distance from Earth. He apparently used a system of geometry that measured the time it took for the moon to cross a shadow. He arrived at some fairly accurate estimates, apparently, that would be refined and approved upon later by, astronomers as people were understanding this as a science. Now, this was, this all seems very advanced, right? We're like getting to this point where we're like, wow, this is actually getting like, I feel like, we were learning about Galileo discovering this stuff, 2,000 years later, right? That kind of stuff. As it turns out, ancient Greece would fall by the wayside, as most, ancient empires do, as most empires do eventually. And the Romans would rise up in its place, and they would bring back a lot of the superstition and mythology with the gods. And so that's sort of what ended up happening and sort of curtailed a lot of this scientific invention and theorizing during this period of time.
It's a great illustration of how scientific thought is often rejected by people in power, the masses sometimes. And thankfully that's changed.
Right. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about that anymore. Oh, sad. All right. Well, let's go ahead and jump to our very first ad break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of the modern sort of human interaction with the moon and technology, and a little bit of science fiction as well, because the moon has impacted it all. So
I've been waiting for this.
We will be right back. And we're back. We are talking all about the moon today, that big glowing orb in the sky. That's not the sun. That's another thing. Get to that in a later episode, probably. We'll see. I think it should be an episode, the sun.
I think we're committing to it right now, I think
we're committing to it, yeah. All right, well, that'll happen someday. Well, I don't know
when.
On
the list, yep.
Let's get back. We're going to talk a little bit more about sort of the more modern-ish human interaction with the moon. So one of the big inventions that we use today people can have one in their house, but one of the big inventions that would spawn out of people's curiosity with the moon would be the telescope. Hunter, have you ever used a telescope before?
I believe I have. I'm trying to recall a specific instance of using it, but I know that I've looked through one before.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of amazing, right? It's like I've used one to look at Jupiter or Saturn, and like you can just have one. They're kind of big, it's like kind of bulky, but like it's not like abnormally large. Like it can sit on my lap essentially.
Right.
And it's kind of amazing that you can point this thing at a celestial object that looks like just like a little twinkle of a star, and from there, see in greater detail the rings of Saturn. Right? That's an amazing invention.
Yeah,
it's impressive. In fact, again, we have this guest episode with Trevor from Astro Plateau on Thursday. And now we didn't ask him how a telescope works. And now I'm kind of bummed that we didn't do that.
Yeah, it would have been a good question.
That would have been a really good question. Oh, well, it's still a really fantastic episode. Come back and listen to it. Well, so the telescope was invented sort of in the 17th century or CE, Common Era. And it was inspired by a lot of these original fanciful tales about the moon. So with people able to finally see the moon's surface reasonably well for the first time, it sort of began a new age of discovery of astronomy, right? This is sort of what it started the gears in motion of, what's going on up there. And it also started to spawn a lot of science fiction, people's popular imaginations, not necessarily about these things that are gods or anything like that, but what was up there, right? So authors at the time, as the telescope was being invented, people were actually getting pictures and being able to look at this thing. They started speculating about lunar life forms, right? Is there people up there looking down on us and wondering what's this blue green marble thing?
Using their own or whatever, yeah.
Exactly. Are there rivers and oceans, right? These early telescopes, you could see in greater detail, but you couldn't see to the same degree that you can see today. So we're going to talk about there are some reasons why they thought there might have been liquid water of some form up there. And then are there similar mountains, plains, that kind of stuff? Just what's going on? Is there any sort of similarities between what we experience here on Earth and up there on the moon? And so some of the stories were wildly fantastical. So 17th century historian, writer, and bishop Francis Godwin wrote The Man in the Moon, a story about a man named Domingo Gonzalez who hitches a vehicle to a breed of swans that migrate to the moon. Once there, he discovers an inhabited world with oceans and a race of tall Christian people living in a lunar paradise. So it gets a little weird there, little religious-y, but I guess not uncommon for this.
Continues to figure prominently, yeah.
It does. I mean, yeah, it definitely does, especially if you think about during this time, this would probably be sort of the latter end of the Renaissance period, where there's still a lot of interplay between, arts and religion and all these kinds of things. Other science fiction stories offered more plausible vision of lunar travel, something more akin to what astronomers would later actually imagine, right? So, for instance, in 1865, French author Jules Verne published De la Terre à la Lune, a story of proto-astronauts traveling to the moon in a capsule fired from a cannon. Now, that is about as close as I think you can get.
Right? Yeah. It's pretty solid.
In his 1901 classic, The First Men in the Moon, H.G. Wells imagined an anti-gravity material used to steer a craft to the moon, predicting the great difficulties that later astronauts would have exiting Earth's gravitational pull, which again, I think this is after the theory of gravity, of course, right? This is 1901. People understand this, but this is still, I think, very prescient. Both of these authors are very prescient because they're imagining issues that astronomers would actually have a hard time figuring out, right? Obviously, we know Earth's gravitation, Earth had gravity at this point, but nobody in 1901 really knew how hard or how intense and how much energy would actually be needed to escape that gravitational pull, at least not to the same degree we do today. In Russia, the first ever rocket scientist, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, wrote his own science fiction novel, On the Moon, in which he accurately portrayed the experience of standing on the moon and the effects that low gravity would have on the body, which again, I think it's kind of amazing that people are thinking about these things. Now, we just ran through 3 stories of people who sort of got things right. There's probably a million stories that completely get it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of theories involving the moon landing not actually having happened, all this kind of stuff. So people have lots of thoughts about the moon.
Right. And so this kind of leads us to what we're going to talk about right now, which is the space race, because we did actually go to the moon. That's something that happened. And listener, if you recall, I already made this plug at the beginning, but we do have 2 really great episodes all about the space race. One that covers the classic space race that took place in the middle of the 1900s, middle to the late 1900s. And then the second episode, which covers sort of the modern day space race, or what's happening now. What are people trying to do?
Go check.
But Hunter, I was wondering if you could summarize sort of what was the classic space race? Like what was that?
Well, there was there was the race to get to the moon, I think is what you're referring to. And the idea was that you could demonstrate the advanced character of your country or your society by somehow getting to the moon first. And that would prove to the rest of the world that this would be the most advanced thing. And so, and particularly this happened in the context of the Cold War. So there were big efforts between the United States and what was then the Soviet Union to try to accomplish this feat.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to go through a little bit some of the dates and sort of the things that happened here in a minute. But I think the space race, at least the 1900 space race, I think was such a fascinating period of time because prior to this moment, nation states have been in contest with each other for millennia, right?
Right.
And the way that they usually have contested with each other has been through war. Right. And not just war, but
trade sometimes as well.
Trade as well, yeah. But certainly in terms of like, and obviously colonization, that was a big contest as well. But war was such a big aspect of it because it was about who can have the better weapon soonest, right?
Right.
You know, if you're inside the medieval period of Europe, right, different alloys of steel would guard different, soldiers from arrows now, that kind of stuff. As you get into sort of World War I, which, we had a whole episode, a little while ago, that was a war that throughout the war, they were inventing new weapons at rapid pace so that they could one-up each other. And I think the space race is so interesting because you have these two really big powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, that are actively competing. And they're competing in terms of war, obviously the Cold War, not a hot war, though it does get hot in different places. But this is an aspect where they're competing for something that is, I would argue, so unique and unusual that for the aspect that it happened, that one country was like, let's do this, and the other one was like, oh, we need to do this too, and then kicks off this whole thing, was very unique. And while I'm sure there's some negative externalities that were born out of this space race, I would argue there's also a lot of positives, and it potentially could have, moved some of the energy away from the war side as well as both countries focused on the space race side, which is probably a net benefit for us all.
Well, and then it also had this huge impact on popular culture in the United States.
Oh, absolutely.
Thinking of the aesthetics of particularly the 1960s. I'm thinking, the Jetsons aesthetic here, the Space Needle and all this kind of stuff. And this is all directly related to what we're talking about, this space race and this race to the moon and the imagination of what's going to happen in the future. And so I think that's part of it too, is that each of these countries or each of these societies are aspiring to have control of the future as well.
Absolutely. So I've waxed a little bit about the space race. I've waned a little bit. Let's get into sort of what happened. Again, this is highly abridged. This will be like 5-6-ish minutes of space race talk, but you can go listen to a couple hours of it if you want.
We've got the
more
episode
detail.
Remix. Yeah, check it out.
Absolutely. So after World War II, both the United States and Soviet Union made rapid progress in space exploration. So both countries had taken many of the best rocket scientists from post-war Germany, which was seen as a leader, right? The V2 rocket was invented in Germany and was a very horrible weapon at the time. And they put them to working, some of them, to working in the cause of space travel. Obviously, some of them also went towards weapons research as well. Mm-hmm. But it would be the Soviets diverted substantial resources into new experiments and because of this, they quickly took the lead in the space race, which I don't think is popularly known in at least here within the United States. I think most people think the U.S. was always ahead, and therefore XYZ. And it's like, well, not really,
not the case. Yeah,
not the case. So on October 4th, 1957, the Soviets successfully launched the first artificial satellite Sputnik into space. I'm sure you've heard of that, Hunter. Yeah, can you just, I have an image in my head. I'm wondering, do you know what it looks like?
Don't know if I know exactly what it looks like.
It's funny because for some reason I have this image in my head that I saw a while ago, I guess, probably years. But it's like this little sphere and it just has like these little antenna and it kind of looks like this little spiky ball that they just sent up there. Anyway, so this little sphere went up, circled the Earth, transmitting a repeating series of bloops and bleeps and beeps and whatever. Nothing more. That's it. But that was still a monumental thing, right? Nobody had ever done that before.
Now it's under the sea in Point Nemo.
Exactly. Yes. So at this point, the Soviets were well ahead of the U.S. in terms of space exploration. To make matters worse for the U.S., their own first satellite launch on December 6, 1957, failed miserably. So this was just a couple months afterwards, but it did not work out well for NASA and the United States. So
we don't refer to it in the Sputnik kind of way, right? I mean, it doesn't really seep into the popular vernacular.
No, again, I would argue most people who aren't historians or space people probably never knew that the first satellite that we tried to launch failed. I don't think it's not taught. I don't think.
No, I mean, in history classes throughout the United States, these are not the things that are emphasized.
Right, exactly. So apparently hurting from this humiliation, the first ever satellite, blowing up, President Kennedy initiated a massive push to get the U.S. to the moon. And so on May 25th, 1961, he unveiled the Apollo mission, driven more than anything else, apparently, by the urgent need to beat the Soviet Union. Both sides saw it as a contest between capitalism and communism, which were the two competing economic sort of theories at the time. Maybe it still is. I don't know.
Ideologies, yes.
Ideologies, yada, yada. Apparently, if the U.S. could get to the moon first, it would prove that capitalism was superior. I don't know why. I mean, it seems arbitrary to me, but sure, I guess. So the U.S. began to direct its budget into the Apollo program. In today's money, it would cost well over $100 billion. That's way more than what NASA's annual budget is today. So this is just a single program within NASA. Obviously, it was a really big program within NASA, but just a single one. And of course, the U.S. would go on and reach the moon, right? And we're going to talk about that in a second. But I did want to call it that the Soviets had achieved other firsts aside from the first, satellite in space. So they put the first woman into space.
Okay.
They had the first spacewalk, which is like getting out of your ship, and I guess you're not walking, you're floating.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah. And they had the first cosmonauts to fly in normal clothes rather than spacesuits. So if you look at, videos of the, International Space Station, they're not all in spacesuits the whole time. They are like, I mean, they're not in I don't think they're in tennis shoes and shorts and a t-shirt.
They're not in tuxedos either. Yeah, they're just sort of like lounging clothes or, business casual, I think. Yeah.
Right. Business casual.
Yeah.
Business casual for the space crowd. Exactly. So I just wanted to call that out. The Soviets had a few other firsts. So it was really getting to the point where it's like, okay, the U.S. has the moon and nothing else. I mean, there's probably some things that the U.S. did as well, but the Soviets were dunking on them constantly during this time. However, the U.S., the enormous budget that they gave NASA would pay off. So the Apollo 11 mission landed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon on July 20th, 1969. And this is probably what most people here in the United States and maybe in other, allied countries learn most about with regards to the space race, that the U.S. was the first to land on the moon. And it was a very impressive, feat of engineering and ingenuity and all this kind of stuff, right? It's just phenomenal that we've been able to do that still to this day.
I mean, one of the more remarkable things in my memory of this situation is that they placed the U.S. flag on top of the moon, as if, that's like a classic territorial grab, right? It's like, we claim this moon for the United States or whatever. And I'm sure a lot of other countries were kind of rolling their eyes at that. It's like, really? I mean, you put the U.S. flag up there?
I find it funny because not only did they do that, but at the same time, it's like under that quote, it's one small step for man, one giant leap for all mankind, or something like that.
Right.
obviously, at the time, the popular sort of verbiage was man for standing in for humans, right? This is talking about all of humans, but it's still like the idea that you're talking about, we're doing this for all of humankind, and then boom, here's a big old American flag.
That's right. Yeah.
It is interesting, right?
Thought of that ahead of time. It's not like, I mean, I don't know, maybe he was inspired at that moment to say that, but he'd probably been thinking for weeks or maybe months about, all right, got to have a great line for when this happens. I don't know the story.
Can you imagine if he just like fumbled it? It's like,
right. One small leap for me. Yeah, I don't know. There's all kinds of ways it could happen.
Well, that we're going to leave the space race from here. We're going to go ahead and jump to our final ad break, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk more about sort of the actual geography of the moon, how it impacts our planet and maybe humans and wildlife and that kind of stuff, because it does have a more physical impact.
Yes,
as it turns out, at least on some aspects of our planet. So,
and there's a geographic expression to that.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. So we're going to do our last ad break, and we'll be back. So come back after these ads. Thank you. And we're back. We're talking all about the moon today on the Geography is Everything podcast. We just ran through sort of some space race stuff, some other history stuff. Now we're going to talk about what is probably the actual geography of the moon. Sort of how does the moon impact things right here on the planet? And so there's this idea that like we are all attuned to a circadian clock, the circadian rhythm, which is sort of the rhythmic cycle of days and nights. And this is true to an extent, right? Hunter, you probably, I don't know about your sleeping schedule, but you probably went to bed sometime last night, I don't know, 10, 11 p.m. And then you probably woke up sometime this morning between 7, 8, 9 a.m., something like that. That's what most people generally do, right?
Right. When it's dark, it's time to sleep, kind of. Yeah.
Exactly. It
Not for
nighttime.
everybody, but that's the standard thing. In fact, we're told that if you don't do that it's unhealthy for you.
Right. Yeah. So there's, obviously there are people who work overnight, so they have jobs that take place during the nights. A lot of people do, right? That's not
graveyard shift.
Not most people probably, but a lot of people do that.
That's right.
We are told, I don't have the science here to back this up, but we are told, generally that if you do that, there are certain health implications there. Mm-hmm. Something, XYZ bad. I don't know. I'm going to leave it at that. There are, while this is common for most creatures, right? Dogs, cats, deers, I don't know, other things out there. There are species out there that are not tuned to the circadian rhythm, the day-night cycle. However, they're attuned to what is called the circulunar rhythm. And this largely applies to things that live in the ocean. Do you know why? Why might this be?
No. I was going
to give you a hint. It has to do with sort of what the moon is directly doing to oceans, particularly around our coasts, our shores.
Oh, right. So it's the tides, right? Impacting the tides, and that impacts the availability of food, I suppose.
Exactly. So, and listener, we dive a little bit more into the science behind this with our guest on Thursday. Let's dive a little bit more into sort of what all this does and how it means. But let's talk a little bit about the tides now, because the tides do change and come in and out with the moon, right? It's not necessarily it's not a circadian thing. It's not like every day at nighttime the tides go out and every day during the daytime the tides come back in. No, it's whatever the moon is doing at the time. And so because of this, there are certain species such as the fiddler crab, which always forages at low tide, which has been attuned and evolved to be the circulunar wildlife. So, in fact, there's another term for it. I mean, circulunar is sort of the circulunar rhythm, but tidal clock is sort of the more precise verbiage to use for this species. So, apparently, the fiddler crab. There we go. Their tidal clock is 12 hours and 25 minutes long, exactly the time between two low tides. Wow. Rather than 24 hours, which is what our clock is. Strikingly, even when they're under constant light and temperature in captivity, fiddler crabs are most active when the tide is out. So The light apparently has no change in sort of their evolutionary biology.
They're just
Fascinating.
programmed that way, or they're geared towards that after so many years.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably embedded in their genetic code at this point, right? And so that's the fiddler crab. Now, there's also, Hunter, there's this popular idea that humans are also affected by the phase of the moon. Do you know, you know what I'm talking about here?
Perhaps you're referring to the idea that when there's a full moon, people get a little wild. There's lots of erratic behavior. And you hear this, I think, every month, usually. It's like, wow, there's some weird energy out there. Well, it was a full moon.
Exactly. So this is a very common myth out there that humans are impacted when there's a full moon. Exactly what you said. Things get a little more crazy. People are, whatever.
Not everybody would call it a myth, I suppose. I don't want to deny science, but some people have this pretty strong belief that, this is a thing.
Fair. Well, it's as far as science is concerned, it is a common misconception that humans are at all impacted by the phase of the moon. So there's just nothing there to back it up. So this idea stems from an old belief that the moon exerts an influence on the oceans, and because it can do that, right? It can change the tides and everything. Because it can do that, it must also do so on human bodies, right? This gravitational pull, and therefore that is causing chemistry, imbalances that impact people. However, as it turns out, this idea that it's the gravitational pull that also impacts the tides, that impacts us, can't be true, because the moon's gravitational pull on the human body is so weak that it can't even be measured, really. Apparently, a passing fly, one of those things buzzing around you right now because it's summer and it's so annoying,
right? A
passing fly exerts a greater gravitational pull on your body than the moon, the sun, and all the stars in the universe combined. So I don't know how they figured that.
Yeah. Well, we have a term in the English language that refers to this idea that people go crazy in a full moon. You know what word that is?
Well, if it's the same word I have here in my notes, it's going to be lunatic.
Oh, it is. Oh my God. Yeah, you're right. Sorry. I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
No, I thought it was so funny. Like, you brought it up at the perfect time. Yeah. Lunatic is like, I didn't know this before this. When I was pulling together my notes and I was doing the research, I was reading this book, and it's like, oh yeah. I mean, at this point, if any word in the English language starts with LUN, maybe an A in there too, you just assume that it's factoring in the moon some way.
Right. I think this must come from Latin or something. And then I think it was also used to demonize women in particular, the idea of lunatic as well. So there's a sort of a gendered aspect to this thing as well. And sometimes in certain mythologies, women are associated with the moon. So that's another piece of culture that's been impacted by the moon.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, we just ran through sort of the misconception here that, there's some sort of gravitational impact, whatever, on humans, and this causes things to happen. Science doesn't really back it up. People have their different beliefs, and that's okay. That said, though, the moon does have an effect on our seasons and length of day, which could have impacts on humans, right? These would be less tangible impacts. So it all gets a bit squishy. And I would argue the moon's impact is more of an indirect rather than direct, but it seems to be there. So you should come back on Thursday. We talk a little bit more about this with Trevor, but perhaps because of the seasonal changes. Yeah, I don't know. Whatever. We talk a little bit more about it. And so with that, Hunter, I thought it might be nice just to end today's episode on maybe a conversation around the future of the moon. So yeah, why not? We're here. So in recent years, we talked a little bit about this inside our space race episode, the modern space race, but we're going to talk a little more about the future-ish here. So in recent years, a lunar base has returned as a topic of discussion within the scientific community, international scientific community. Can you come up with any ideas of why we would want a moon base, Hunter?
I can think of a few things. I mean, one is the same reason that there was a race to get to the moon in the first place, which is that will sort of demonstrate the advanced scientific power of a particular part of the Earth, right? So that's one of the politics, in other words, is one of them. Another thing is I can imagine there might be some advantages to conducting certain research on the moon that would provide some kind of different perspective on things. And they're trying to, instead of having to simulate the lack of gravity, that they can do that on the moon. And then it's just a little bit closer to other places. And so if you want to get to Mars or some other planet, seems like Mars is the one that we really want to get to for some reason. I'm not sure why that is. That this would be a good starting point. And, it takes a lot, like you said, to get away from the Earth, and maybe getting off the moon would be easier.
Yeah, exactly. I think all of what you just said is probably, that's probably what anybody would say. I also don't know why we want to go to Mars, if I'm being honest.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure there's an answer, which we don't have, which we might have to find out at some point. But yeah, there's this, and science fiction is obsessed with Mars, it seems like, above all other planets, right?
Right. We have a whole class of some sort of alien called Martians
That's right.
Obviously they don't exist because, well, I guess we have some robots out there and we haven't found any Martians. I don't know. Maybe there are somewhere.
Maybe Martians, there may not be, but we've certainly not run into any recently.
Well, for all of what you just said, I think all of that makes sense, right? There's this idea that, for one, radio astronomy, which is the idea of sending out radio signals and getting, maybe getting something back, or sending them out and getting sort of the reflection back that helps us understand a lot of things. Having one on the moon apparently would be highly beneficial for that kind of scientific discovery, because as it turns out, the Earth has a lot of background noise. And so even just having a radio telescope in space, but still orbiting Earth, is still quite noisy. Obviously, having one on Earth is even noisier. So that would make the reception a lot more clear, apparently.
Radio station.
But then also, radio station on the moon. Yep. And apparently also, if we want to continue exploring space, having a lunar base would be a lot more advantageous. There's this idea, I watch a lot of Star Trek, but I'm sure this is the case for Star Wars or whatever science fiction you might enjoy. But they're always building these really massive ships. They're not building them on a planet. They're not building them on Earth. They're building them in these like space station things up in space. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because you don't have to, once you're in space, you don't have to worry about getting something out of a planet. You can just sort of travel from place to place.
Right. Yeah. Because that's part of the trick, is launching something, right? Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So if you can build, if you want a fully habitable vessel for, let's say, 50 people to go to Mars for whatever reason, and you want to get them there, building something in space that's going to be big enough so that they can sort of live in the 2-year journey it might take, whatever, and do all the things it might need, is going to be a lot easier building that thing in space and sending it out to Mars, rather than building it on Earth and having to launch it then into space, right? So
a huge saving on rocket fuel. If it's made in space, you just turn the key and go. It's
right.
Plug and play. Yep.
Right. And so those are some of the starting possibilities. We dive into this a little bit more with Trevor. So again, come back and listen to that episode. He has some ideas that probably dive a little bit deeper into sort of what we've said here, because we're not astronomers. We're not really space people. We're very much Earth people. It's like that's kind of our whole deal.
That's right.
But I thought it might just be fun to sort of like talk a little bit about the very far distant future of the moon. Like, so far, this might be the farthest we go into the future as well. We started a few billion years in the back, and now we're going to go billions of years into the future. So according to NASA and scientists, at some point in the far distant future, we may no longer have a moon at all. Do you know why this is, Hunter?
Maybe it gets bored of being by the Earth and floats away, or maybe it gets hit by an asteroid, or maybe the gravitational pull from something else pulls it away. This is my science fiction take on things. Yeah.
I like your boredom aspect, because that's kind of the one that's probably most true. According to NASA, the moon drifts about 1 inch away from Earth each year. That's not a lot.
It's not a lot, right? But it adds up.
Apparently, it adds up over time. Apparently, at this rate, in about 15 billion years, the moon will drift away from the planet. Will no longer be orbiting Earth. Obviously, we will never see that. In fact, given how long humans as a species have been around, it's unlikely any form of humans will be around in 15 billion years. In fact, it's highly unlikely because the sun is theorized to only have about 7 or 8 billion years left in it before it goes red giant and completely engulfs Earth anyways. So it may never even reach that point before it being scorched out of existence.
It's, as you're pointing out, it's nothing that we really need to worry about right now. I mean, we have a lot more problems than the sun burning out in, 7 or 8 billion years.
Mm-hmm.
But I still can't help be a little concerned. But anyways, yeah.
That the moon is just slowly getting farther and farther away.
It's floating away. The sun is going to engulf us. Know that this is way off in the future. Yeah, I better keep focused on some Earth problems, I think.
There's this wild science fiction sort of theory. Obviously, that's all it is. But have you ever heard of this idea of the Dyson sphere?
I've heard of the Dyson sphere, but I'm not sure I know what it is.
Yeah, so it's this idea that you build a massive structure around a sun, a star, right? And the Dyson sphere is then able to control it and siphon off the infinite amount of energy from it to then power everything else.
Wow.
And so
that's a big circle to put around the sun.
It's a big sphere. Yeah, it's real big. And so I don't know, maybe in 6 or 7 billion years, we'll just have a Dyson sphere and we won't have to worry about it. But we also won't have a sun anymore. We can just project the sun, I guess, with the infinite energy it creates.
It will just take care of itself, really, somehow, one way or the other.
That's it. That's our episode about the moon. Hunter, tell people where they can find you around the
Thanks, Jeff. Super interesting stuff today. My name is Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portland is a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. My co-author there is David Banis, and I am co-host with you, Jeff, Geography is Everything podcast, which you're listening to right now.
Yeah, my name's Jeff, co-host of this podcast that you just finished listening to. If you liked what you heard today, you thought this was a fun, engaging conversation on the moon, please rate, review, subscribe, whether this is on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. It all helps. We love seeing it all. If you want this sort of delivered straight to your email box, just go over to geographyiseverything.substack.com. Eventually, I'll do something more with that page because we have a few thousand people subscribed, but I haven't figured it out yet, and I am pretty busy. So eventually, maybe it'll spin out to be something more. But if you just want it in your email box, go over there. It's a good place to do that.
It's not going to take 7 or 8 billion years, so we'll get to it.
It won't take 7 or 8 billion years, I promise. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, go do that. Next week, Hunter, what are we doing? I think
next week's topic,
actually,
I believe is the Summer Olympics. Does that sound right?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, because the Summer Olympics are coming up.
They are.
So, yeah. So that should be a really fun one because the Summer Olympics, the IOC is a fascinating, if not diabolical, organization.
It's an interesting organization. And the Olympics is inherently geographical because there are contestants from different parts of the world that come together in one city in order to prove their proficiency, their dominance, their excellence in a very particular sport. And new sports are added sometimes. So we'll get into, a little bit of the history, some of the contemporary stuff, and consider some of the various geographies of the Olympics, including why the modern Olympics was even recreated in the first place.
Absolutely. It should be a fascinating episode. I think we haven't done one on sports in a little while, and that's one of the things we really like to talk about. So
that's right.
It should be really fun for both of us, and therefore it will be fun for you, listener, because you will engage in our fun as well.
That's right. So it's a little warm up for the Olympic Games. So check it out, and then get ready to watch some.
And then, dive on in.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, I guess until then, please come back, listen to that episode, and it's been fun talking all about the moon and all that kind of stuff. So, bye.
Thanks for listening.